as of yesterday, announced on Monday, South Africans no longer required to isolate if you test positive and you're asymptomatic. It's also government also reduced the isolation period for people who do have symptoms to just 3 days. That was announced earlier this week on Monday evening. So it's being asymptomatic back at work. But what is best practice, and what has happened over the last 2 years is we've developed problems and we're finding solutions for them as they happen. Lauren Salt is an executive at ENS's law firm's employment department. She's a legal analyst there. This is largely a result, I believe, of businesses and the economic sector wanting to get back at work. There are plenty of people who have tested positive, like myself, 2 weeks ago, Lauren, who was asymptomatic, so fully able and healthy to work, but because of regulations, back at the having to stay at home. It raises very new problems for employers. Firstly, I would want to know, as an employer and an employee, has the Department of Health in an Omicron environment detailed what exactly asymptomatic person is? On my second day of isolation, I was tired, but I have 2 children. Of course I'm going to be tired. So has that been explained yet?
Hi, Lisa. Thanks. I am sure that the tiredness was due to the children and not the Omicron. But certainly there's no real guidance coming out of this change to the adjusted alert level 1. As to what exactly asymptomatic means and when you might become asymptomatic. So we also have a conundrum at the moment where we've got the consolidated direction on occupational health and safety in certain workplaces. Some of you might know them as the vaccination guidelines, which is where mandatory vaccination was first introduced in June last year. And that still deals with when employers can permit employees to come back to work. And that still references the old isolation period. So I think we're going to see some new guidance coming out. There are guidelines at the moment that the Department of Health have issued about handling COVID positive employees in the workplace. And that doesn't take into account this new regulation dealing with isolation or lack of isolation for asymptomatic workers.
Yes, let me just correct something. Apologies. It's shortened by 3 days, not 2-3 days. So still 7 days isolation for symptomatic people. It also raises a whole new set of questions about, of course, COVID-19 is deemed a notifiable disease. But in terms of employee privacy, if I am asymptomatic, if I'm asymptomatic, returning to work, is it then notifiable for all my colleagues and people around me? And then I couple that question with the issue of stigma around people returning to the office, and then no one wants to sit next to Lester because Lester is positive, but he's not expressing any symptoms.
Absolutely, and this is certainly going to play out in exactly the way that you seem to anticipate. Again, looking at the consolidated direction, there is still a provision in there that says that if an employee thinks they are at serious risk of contracting COVID, they can withhold their labor. And this is something that we've seen employees rely on fairly regularly over the past few months, particularly when we had the rise in Delta infection. So any cough or sniffle, people were vacating the premises and saying they were withholding their labor because they thought they were going to get sick. So again, we've still got that regulation sitting in the consolidated direction, which means employees can still rely on it. And if you've got someone who's asymptomatic but is tested positive for COVID, who's to say that the person sitting next to them isn't going to get COVID?
And that then also raises the question of the rights of a healthy colleague, and how comfortable they feel. Would I necessarily feel hypothetically comfortable if I know that Johannes here in studio with me is positive and asymptomatic? Could I then tell my employer, but I do not want to share a studio with someone who is asymptomatic yet positive? So the rights of someone to return to work, because that could very much for someone who takes home a day's wages or a weekly wages, losing a day's pay does mean something, but it also then should reflect the right of the other person to say, well, I feel uncomfortable in this workspace.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to see, particularly in circumstances where the consolidated direction rather, in its current form, recognizes that employees who withhold their labor in that fashion can't be penalized. So you've got a situation where there's a bit of incongruity with the current adjusted regulations and the consolidated direction. I think we're probably going to see some updated consolidated directions dealing with these sorts of issues that we're talking about now. But certainly as it currently stands, an employee who feels that they are at risk of contracting the virus can withhold their labor and without occupational detriment or ramifications because of that. So we're certainly going to need some guidance as to how to manage that. And it's certainly the right of others to understand what their risk is in the workplace and how they might be impacted.
I know for the times that I've been ill, and I've gotten a sick note under a reason for absence. My doctor would just say illness or sick and not disclose. And look, we are also human. Who wouldn't mind a couple of days off work and it just gets taken off your sick leave? Do you think we'd reach a point where employers would require some sort of proof of symptom? Like I could probably hold my nose and pretend I'm a little bit stuffy. I think there's all these sort of hypotheticals that in real world situations could come to the fore. Would my employer say, well, prove that you're asymptomatic. If not, come to work.
Yeah, and absolutely. So, employers' rights around sick leave and abusive sick leave will remain. So if you produce a medical certificate that the employer thinks you might be taking the mickey or abusing the situation, they can certainly make inquiries as to whether or not it's valid. And what that means is you may or may not be paid if the employer decides that it is going to reject your sick note on the basis that it thinks that you're not being genuine about your illness. So certainly there's going to be some questions around how we manage employees who are asymptomatic, who are trying to either say that they want to stay at home and isolate, or that we've got people coming into the workplace who potentially are symptomatic but are trying to say that they are asymptomatic. Because again, what we know from COVID is that it presents in many different ways. Yeah. Someone might just be severely tired. Someone may have a mild headache, but not a cough. So they may not have any visible symptoms, but they certainly aren't asymptomatic.
And someone who wants to come to work because a day's wages means something to them. And what happens to many of us who have a big deadline, or we simply just want to get that day's wages. We tell ourselves, many of us, we'll push through it. I'll take a effervescent tablet and I'll get through the day, and that then could pose a danger then to other people around us.
Yeah, and there's certainly also employees, Lester, who don't want to go and get tested because it's going to be a cost that they just can't afford. So I think this is going to present all sorts of challenges to employers. But there's certainly nothing precluding an employer from putting in place their own regulations dealing with these individuals. And so what we've seen overseas is employers looking to impose more stringent isolation for people who have tested positive, even if they are asymptomatic, and even when the law says they don't need to isolate. But in those instances, an employer would not be able to say, you're asymptomatic, but you must stay at home and I'm not going to pay you. So if any of these more stringent requirements are at the employer's behest, it's likely that they're going to have to foot the bill for those additional stringent requirements. Well,
this was an announcement that was made on Monday night after a cabinet meeting deciding on these new regulations. But it's still a few days before we'll see new regulations being published by the Department of Labour and Employment. Surely the regulations as well as as broader statements should come at the same time, so that we don't have situations where workers and employers are in this sort of this fuzzy area of what we know the regulations to be, or the government announcement to be, but don't know how this affects us operationally.
So these regulations have in fact been published, and they at the moment are the state's best kept secret. They're fairly difficult to find, but they were released during the course of yesterday. The one thing that hasn't been changed, though, is this consolidated direction. And there's absolutely no indication when we might see a change to that. And of course, that is a fairly comprehensive document that deals with more than just isolation. It deals with the likes of mandatory vaccination, reporting of COVID positive cases. It incorporates a whole lot of guidelines which are now outdated. So we are in this bit of a conundrum at the moment, and where we've got incongruent pieces of legislation. But certainly, insofar as the isolation periods are concerned, the new regulations, adjusted alert level 1 regulations, will take precedence over the consolidated direction.
Lauren Salt, Labour Law Analyst, thank you so much for joining us.